Thanks, everybody. We're going to be going over a case study for the risk-based corrective action program that the DEQ has put out over the last couple of years. The past couple of remediation conferences or reclamation conferences, the DEQ has given really wonderful presentations on their perspective of the program. So hopefully today we get to dive a little bit into how we as environmental consultants are applying this program to some sites out here in the Bakken. So first question we always ask is, what is risk? Kind of a fancy definition from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Risk is overall the unwanted event that may or may not occur. Second way of looking at risk is the cause of an unwanted event that may or may not occur. And then the one that we really look at, that I believe we look at when it comes to environmental impacts, is the probability of an unwanted event that may or may not occur. And that event may be, someone's interaction with some environmental impacts. I have some pictures up there. Just again, every day we deal with risk. You guys all got likely into a car this morning. This risk associated with that driving here to this conference. We maybe participate in some risky activities in our lives, such as rock climbing. And then obviously the cliche is everybody here knows the risks of cigarettes. So, all right. As I mentioned, the DEQ has given some really good talks on the Rebecca program. Fortunately, Carl's not here. I want to give him credit, but I stole this slide from his presentation from a few years ago, but I thought he put it so eloquently. Was the conventional ways we used to look at cleaning up oil and gas spills is how much of that chemical mass can we remove? That's been kind of the way we've always approached these problems. But once you start adding the risk factor into it, we start asking the question, how much chemical mass can we safely leave behind? So we'll kind of cover that a little bit. So we kind of talked about risk overall, but in this case with a risk-based corrective action, we're looking at environmental risk. So environmental risk, we look at three factors. We've got ecological impacts. What is that oil spill? What is that natural gas release? What's the ecological impact of that? And if we decide to leave some of that chemical mass behind, what's the current and future impacts that could present? There's a big human health component to this. If we do decide to leave some of that chemical mass behind, what's the long-term potential human health risks that come associated with that? Then, as always, we do, as I'm in the real world, we do have to consider the financial liability if we do decide to leave environmental impacts in place or not. So, as I mentioned in the previous slide, just kind of wanted to recap some of our conventional methods that we use out in the oil field for corrective actions. I think we've heard a lot today about kind of the tried and true is the dig and haul method. There's a lot of pros to that. It's fast. It works. Get that impacted media out of there, dispose of. But some of the cons that come with it, as John mentioned earlier with the Goliath one, the thing that he's looking into is, can we preserve our natural soils here in North Dakota as much as possible? Also waste. We're filling up our landfills with more and more impacted soils. So we're always looking at ways of reducing that waste. And another thing I underlined there is some things we don't consider is excavation can be limited. We're working around active infrastructure, so we do have to leave some material in place. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here coming up. But some other strategies we use out in the oil field, remediation systems are great. They work. They've been working for decades. But out in the Bakken, we do have some limitations. If we have a pipeline release in the middle of a field, kind of hard to get power out there to run a remediation system. Something else that we utilize a lot is bioremediation. It's really great. I'm a big proponent of it. It promotes that natural attenuation, can be done in situ. It's pretty natural process, but the unfortunate thing, we live in a cold climate, so it's inevitably slow. And then the last one that we really don't utilize, but it is common throughout the environmental world, is in situ chemical oxidation. Again, like remediation systems, it's fast, it works quick. However, we're working around underground infrastructure, oil and gas infrastructure. There are those risks of using that, which is it's highly corrosive exothermic reactions. It's actually dangerous to work with those chemicals. So there's a risk associated with that. So, all right. So kind of tying it back together here, I view Rebecca, or the risk-based corrective action, as really a complementary tool that we can use with those conventional methods. And also it really kind of formalized the process that we use as environmental professionals when we go out and assess these sites. We go out, we collect our data, and we'll walk through this with a case study here coming up, but go out there, collect our data, we build our conceptual site model. We use that conceptual site model to look at our exposure and develop our exposure model. We look at our exposure pathways, start evaluating our site under those circumstances, and then we use our conceptual site model and our exposure model to complete the Rebecca evaluation. And then we can further take that, do some fate and transport modeling, and come up to an overall evaluation of the risk of remaining impacts. So as I said, we're going to be going over a case study. This, last two presentations were all about produced water. We're going to come back and talk about hydrocarbons. So under the Rebecca program, the thing with crude oil, natural gas, I think everybody in the room knows, those are made up of hundreds and hundreds of chemicals. So when someone goes out and collects a TPH sample, it's really hard to evaluate that result under a risk-based scenario. You can see on the chart there, that's kind of a generic gas chromatogram of how the lab analyzes a crude oil sample. But under the Rebecca program, they do narrow it down to looking at some hydrocarbon indicator chemicals. And so I think we're all pretty familiar with TPH, the gasoline range, diesel range, things like that. We can break those constituents down even further. So when we're looking at a natural gas spill, we're going to be looking at sampling for benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylenes, which is your BTEX. That kind of covers our main constituents of concern in that gasoline range. And then we got our polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and that's going to cover a lot of those constituents of concern in our diesel range. So here are just some generic pictures of underground pipeline release sites. Just kind of showing, this is kind of at the end when kind of did our source removal excavation. Pipeline's been repaired, everything like that. But as I said, the limitations with excavation is, we have to leave this soil under the pipeline to maintain its integrity. Operators want to get that pipeline repaired, fixed, back in operation as quick as possible. So that's kind of the limitations, at least out in the Bakken with doing excavation around pipeline releases. All right, so got through all of that lead up. Let's talk about a case study. So this was a real site out in the Bakken, but just going to kind of provide the generic information on it. So back in 2022, we had a 1-barrel release of natural gas condensate from an underground pipeline. The initial response, it was a 6,000-foot excavation down to depths of 11 feet. Post-excavation samples were collected. So just kind of going back, these are pictures from this site. These are just some generic pipeline release sites, but basically when Earth Systems gets called out after a pipeline release and repair job has been completed, we'll come out, we'll collect, samples from the floor, from the sidewalls, stuff like that, just to see, what's left. And then if there is groundwater present, such as in this photograph, we'll collect a groundwater sample as well and run it for those Rebecca parameters. So those post-excavation soil samples were collected. However, 12 out of 13 came back clean. So that was a pretty much an overall successful excavation. However, that one sample that came back above DEQ standards located below the pipeline. And then we did have one groundwater sample that was that did have impacts in it. So again, I just kind of summarize this. So still had impacts in place. As I said earlier, we still needed to go out there and collect additional data, additional site information to start building that site conceptual model. We know we have impacts still remaining there. However, we still need to go out there. How much is left? Where is it all at? Things like that. So site assessment work plan was submitted to the DEQ to propose all that. Then in March of 2023, the Rebecca program came out. So we decided to look into that, and we amended our site assessment work plan to include those Rebecca indicator chemicals in our sampling program. All right. So we went out there. We installed a total of 10 soil borings throughout the site. And then where we did find and encounter groundwater, a temporary well was installed in those soil borings. And we collected our data, ran it to a lab. Once we got the results back, started building this conceptual site model. This is kind of an overall generic summary with some fancy colored circles, but basically what it shows, those red circles are where we still have hydrocarbons exceeding the DEQ risk-based screening levels. So obviously right below our pipeline release point, we knew that. However, we did encounter a little bit of soil impacts right below pipeline depth in that SB8. The yellow circles is kind of important. We did encounter groundwater in those soil borings. So groundwater samples came back above risk-based screening levels. However, we did resample those groundwater locations 3 months later, and those hydrocarbon concentrations came below RBSL. So that it told us that they were low level, they attenuated, basically degraded over time. But here it is. So again, this is just some of the groundwater data that we collect, just kind of highlighting here those two wells I mentioned. When they were sampled in June, they had some GRO and benzene above the action levels in RBSLs. And then we come back later in September, and they had attenuated to below those levels. And then this is just showing the immense amount of data that was collected out there. And just kind of showing we had it pretty well defined that the remaining soil impacts that we had in place was right below the pipeline, and then in that soil boring just to the south within the pipeline corridor. And then we do have some data out here where we did collect hydrocarbon indicator data, and then we have some really large numbers there. We may get to that at the end of this presentation, but if not, please feel free to come ask me about it. But we ended up not needing to use this data in this in this Rebecca evaluation. So just to kind of summarize all that, basically at the end of the day, we knew we had some hydrocarbons still remaining in soil below our release point, and then below the pipeline just a little bit to the south. Within the pipeline corridor, those groundwater samples that were impacted, we were able to show some natural attenuation there. And then with those facts, here's kind of a cross section of the data that we collected. So this is basically running from north to south as you go from left to right. Our SB3 on the north of the release point. So the release point there is by SB1. We've got the pipeline running north to south. So just kind of annotated figure here with our impacts remaining below the pipeline. And then there in SB8, soil impacts remaining there. SB5 was one of those locations where we did find an isolated pocket of groundwater, sampled it, came back above levels, sampled it again 3 months later, came back below. All right, so now that we've kind of understood, we've got our impacts delineated and all that, the next step is building this exposure model. And as part of building that exposure model, we do a receptor survey. So the Rebecca program has you do basically a 1,000-foot radius around your site. And we utilize a lot of state resources, Water Commission's website, wetland survey, a lot of really good information out there. But we did a survey here. We have no nearby domestic wells, stock wells, no human residence occupancy. We're not next to a town. We're not next to a school, just kind of out there in the middle of the oil field. We did identify an intermittent stream. It is outside of our radius of influence, or exposure domain, I should say. Sorry about that. But we did, during our receptor survey, identify that Cow Creek is within our 1,000-foot radius. So we do have to consider that. That's a potential sensitive receptor. So once we've kind of done that, kind of walk through the process here. So this is kind of a noisy table here, but we'll kind of walk you through where we look at our media, and then we kind of look at the potential exposure pathways. And then as we go through our evaluation, we'll talk about the results. So surface soils. If you have impacts in surface soils, the exposure pathway there is, someone could inhale it through dust. If you got impacts on some surface soil, it can get in contact with your skin. And then you can also inhale vapors and, like I said, dust, things like that. That's your exposure pathway. Going through the evaluation, we have no surface soil impact, so that exposure pathway is closed. Next, we look at our subsurface soil. So if you're curious how the DEQ defines surface and subsurface soils, our surface soils are upper 2 feet, and any soil below 2 feet is our subsurface soils. So again, with your subsurface soils, you can start to potentially have indoor inhalation issues if you have soil impacts that are below a building. As I mentioned in the previous slide, we do not have any facilities that are below soil impacts, so that pathway goes away. And then again, you can have the potential risk of dermal contact or ingestion of subsurface soils with impacts. I put there, we are below calculated allowable concentrations. Like I said, I'll save the long spiel about that part of the Rebecca process. However, another way we've looked at this one is the remaining impacts are within a pipeline corridor. There are really tight administrative controls around pipeline corridors. So really the only people that are going to come into contact with that impacted material are oil and gas workers, which they have administrative and engineered controls to eliminate any potential risk when it comes to natural gas. So that's one other way we look at that exposure pathway. So that one is also closed out. Now we have groundwater. Same thing with our subsurface soils that can create an indoor inhalation exposure pathway. Again, we can cross that one out. We don't have any occupied buildings out there. I should mention a lot of common occupant buildings that can be occupied by humans out in the oil field. A lot of those are heater treater buildings or any other type of oil and gas infrastructure. They have ventilation systems already put in place for those exact reasons. So a lot of times that's not a considered a completed pathway. And then the probably more important one with our groundwater is our domestic use. However, during our receptor survey, don't have any domestic water wells located nearby. And then we'll talk about here in the next slide, all of the groundwater that we did encounter at the site was shallow and discontinuous, really doesn't have a continuous water bearing zone. So we'll cross that one out for the time being as well. But there are two other really important ones that I didn't cover quite yet is The protection to groundwater, that's impacts that are existing in soil. Can those get into a groundwater way and create an exposure pathway that can lead to the second one that I have listed here, which is groundwater to surface water exposure pathway. Things like that. Also, the protection to groundwater, to look at, does that have the potential of creating an exposure pathway to a nearby domestic well, stock well, things like that. But we've already cleared that. We don't have any nearby wells. However, as I mentioned earlier, we do have that stream. So that groundwater to surface water exposure pathway, how do we look at that? How do we evaluate that? One common way, we didn't utilize this necessarily in this, but just wanted to show one way we do look at that exposure pathway is through fate and transport. So it's just kind of a pictogram here where we've got our potential source generator here. We have a spill. Got our source here in the soil within our water table. That source leaches into our groundwater and then can get in that groundwater and basically transport to a point of exposure, which could be a down gradient well, down gradient, as we mentioned, with groundwater, it could migrate below a residential house and have the potential to create indoor air issues, but also with groundwater, if it's hydraulically connected to a surface water body, that can also be something that we don't want occurring. So that's kind of a really high level view of fate and transport and stuff that we look at. But as for this one, we're concerned about those soil impacts getting into groundwater and transporting to that Cow Creek, which is located north of the site. Bringing back this picture again, just a simplistic way of looking at it. We're looking at these in a lot more detail, but this one really illustrates the fact that these groundwater, little pockets of groundwater that we did have impacts in them. They attenuated. We still have soil impacts below the pipeline depth. However, those impacts happen to get back into that groundwater source. That groundwater source is isolated. That groundwater is not going to migrate. There's no hydraulic connectivity to that Cow Creek. I think we've pretty much shown through our soil boring logs that that's pretty isolated. So therefore, that exposure pathway is also cut off. So, in conclusion, I realize I talked pretty fast, but we'll get to open to some questions here. But basically, just to recap, we have this 1 barrel natural gas pipeline release. Our post-excavation data show those impacts below the pipeline. We went out, installed 10 soil borings, collected soil data, groundwater data, took that information back, built our site conceptual model, then went through, did our receptor survey, started building our exposure model, started evaluating those exposure pathways, and with our site conceptual model, what's the risk, what's the likelihood, what's the potential of those exposure pathways being completed. And we basically concluded that all those exposure pathways were closed. So those impacts that were left below the release point will likely naturally attenuate on their own over time, but time being, evaluated that there was no risk. Packaged that all up into a fancy little report, submitted that to the DEQ, and happy to say we did get a no further action on that site. So again, as I mentioned at the top, I think Rebecca is a really nice addition to the suite of tools that we as environmental consultants and professionals have to not only help our clients deal with our spills that we have out in the Bakken, but it's also a great way to open up communication and look at how we want to approach these sites going forward, not only with the DEQ, our clients, landowners, but also with the researchers here and things like that. I know here at Earth Systems, we're looking forward to not only utilizing Rebecca, but also, try to minimize some of those older techniques of dig and haul, try to preserve our soils and stuff like that. And yeah, I don't know. I'll keep rambling if I don't just stop. So anyways, questions?
We want to stress that Rebecca is not there to do nothing. You know, it's not your first, it's your last resort. It's for when you've done your, you know, the primary goal of it is you've cleaned up to the point where you can. We might not be able to get everything because it's under a pipeline.
Yep.
We don't want to risk digging under a pipeline and risk, you know, the structural integrity of that pipeline, structural integrity of some kind of structure or roadway or something like that. It's for getting that, taking care of that stuff you can't get to. A tiny spill, sure, maybe, you know, we can do something, look at something like that. But it's, you know, as he stressed, you've got to delineate it. You've got it. There's a lot of work to do, Rebecca. It's not the cheap way out. So, you know, spill is in a drainage or right adjacent to a creek. Rebecca's probably not going to do you much good. So just want to make that clear. You know, I think that I appreciate.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate that, Bill, and just also stress too. It's if we decide to say we're following Rebecca, how I view it as it's kind of like formalize that process of, hey, you've done your initial response, you've done your initial pipeline repair or initial cleanup. Now we got to go assess it. The Rebecca guidance program has really packaged everything that the DEQ is already required into a nice little package. So I know when I say, hey, we're going to evaluate this under Rebecca, it's not necessarily, oh, I'm going to ask for closure next week. It's what are we looking at here, and what's the next steps? You know, things like that. So thanks, Bill.